Hi there, and welcome to Continuing Education, a podcast for homeschooling families with actually useful information. I'm Heidi, and today we're going to talk about some homeschooling news that I've noticed the last couple of months. Unlike a news roundup like I did previously, this time we're going to talk about one specific topic. And that's that I started seeing some headlines in January, February that were across the country that were telling a very similar story, where child abuse cases were hidden under the label of homeschooling. So kids were withdrawn from school, then disappeared from view. And now lawmakers in multiple states are pushing for new regulations, things like wellness checks and mandatory testing and bans on homeschooling for certain families. And if you're a homeschooling family listening to this, that probably made you a little nervous. It made your stomach drop a little bit. Because you know that one thing that a lot of homeschoolers are worried about is, what if someone reports me and I don't know what to do to prove to my kid that I'm not neglecting my kiddo, or to prove to them, the person who is checking on things, that I'm not neglecting my kiddo. But here's the truth, and it's often a hard truth that we as homeschoolers, I think, sometimes don't want to hear. Some people have used the label of homeschool as a shield for harm, and that means that we need to talk about this even if it makes us uncomfortable. How do we protect children and protect our freedom to homeschool? How do we build real accountability without handing the state a blank check to regulate our kitchens and our lesson plans? So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're not going to avoid this conversation. We're going to walk right into it and talk about it head on, even though it can be hard to have. So let's start with what we know. In late January, early February of this year, I started noticing a wave of stories that were published nationally about child abuse deaths in families that had withdrawn their kids from school in order to homeschool. So the various states that I saw this was West Virginia, Connecticut, Hawaii, Georgia, and Illinois. I saw stories in all of those states. And in some of those cases, Child Protective Services had already been involved, sometimes multiple times, and sometimes they had not. So one of the most high-profile cases involved an 11-year-old girl named Jacqueline Torres Garcia in Connecticut. Her mom had told officials that she was going to homeschool her, but instead, investigators say that she kind of just used that status to keep her kid home and isolated and out of sight, while abuse escalated. And sadly, Jacqueline died of starvation. And Connecticut's Department of Children and Families is now under intense scrutiny for missing a lot of red flags because they actually had been involved with a family before. Now, Connecticut Senate President Martin Looney has made homeschool reform a top legislative priority. His proposal is to prevent families with prior DCF involvement from withdrawing children to homeschool and improve the information sharing between DCF and the Department of Education. So, similar bills are being introduced or discussed in other states as well. And here's where it can kind of get complicated, I think, because yes, those cases are horrific. And yes, something obviously failed. No child should die of abuse or neglect. But the question is, what failed? And will the proposed solutions that they're suggesting, will they actually prevent future tragedies? Or are they just going to create more paperwork and then treat every homeschooler like a suspect? So before we kind of engage and answer about maybe what a solution could possibly look like, let's talk about how child protection systems actually work and what maybe where they break down. Before I was a homeschooler, before I had kids, early in my career, I worked as a child abuse investigator, and I've been in all kinds of homes. I've been in homes where kids were thriving. I've been in homes where they were not. I've seen abuse and neglect up close. I've worked with some parents to get the education they need to be able to take care of their kiddo and resources they need to be able to take care of their kiddo. And I've sadly also had to take kids into state custody to protect them when parents were unwilling or unable to do so. So if I, as a CPS worker, were to get a call about neglect, educational neglect, this is what I might do. So before I dive into that, actually, let me pause and say most states have an abuse or neglect category called educational neglect, and that's a subset of the regular child neglect. It typically means that a parent is failing to ensure that their kid is receiving legally required education, or they're failing to address a child's significant educational needs. So this can look like things like chronic truancy, or refusing to enroll in a school-age child, or ignoring diagnosed learning disabilities without arranging any kind of alternative support. So in most states, homeschooling, when it's done legally, is not neglect. But the gray area is that if a family says they're homeschooling, but then there's not actually any learning happening, there's no curriculum, there's no record keeping, no progress over time, and the child is significantly behind developmentally or academically, that can and probably should trigger an investigation because that can be neglect. So that can be particularly scary for families whose kids were already behind, or when they were in public school and they were taken out to try to help them and get that individual attention they need. Or it can be really scary for families who have kids have learning disabilities, right? Like, how is the state investigator supposed to know where my kid is or where they should be academically? If I were to get a call about possible educational neglect and I went out to a home to visit, I typically would check for a few things. One, I would just check for the child's basic needs. Are they safe, fed, and supervised? And by that, I mean age appropriately supervised. Some states have minimum ages where a kid can stay home by themselves and some states don't. I would want to make sure if you were gone and your child was home alone, are they age appropriately supervised? Are they old enough to know what to do if something were to happen and they were home alone? Do you have food in the house? Is there violence happening in the house? Those are the first three things: safe, fed, and supervised. The next thing that I would look for if I was looking into educational neglect specifically is I would want to assess if there were books, learning materials, or evidence of educational activity. So some states have really lax rules and some are more strict, but I'm going to look to see if you have some kind of resources like books or materials or online program or charts, some kind of learning material. The next thing that I would try to assess is whether or not your kiddo can demonstrate basic skills for their age. That doesn't necessarily mean that I'm quizzing a 5-year-old, making sure that they know how to read. I think we all have probably encountered that, where we have a family member who comes to visit and they start quizzing our kiddo to make sure they're learning enough. I would try to assess to make sure that they have some basic skills and that they are somewhat meeting a developmentally appropriate skill level based on age or capability. So for example, without any learning disabilities, can this 12-year-old read? That would be different if you had a 7-year-old. I might not care that they can read because that's still a little young. But by 12, they probably should have some basic reading skills unless they have some kind of learning disability going on, right? And so just kind of getting a basic understanding for what their skill level is to suggest how are they learning? Are they making any progress in their own learning? The next thing that I would ask is I would want to make sure that the parent has a plan, even if it's informal. So that could look like something more formal where they've written out their lesson plan for the year or for the month or the semester, whatever that looks like. It could mean that they have curriculums that they use that are kind of planned out. Or it could mean like, hey, I've got younger kiddos and we do letter of the week, right? On A week, we make applesauce and we read all these books that start with A. I just want to know, does the parent have some kind of educational plan? Have they thought this through? And are they trying to make progress with their kiddo? The last thing that I would look for is I would want to know if the family is isolated or do they have connections? I'm talking pediatricians, dentists, family, community. And if I felt so inclined, I might even reach out to those people to ask, like, hey, do you know this family? Can you tell me, have you ever had any concerns about them, right? I would ask questions to that network of people that they have. And here's as a worker, I can tell you that a lot of people didn't understand about CPS, that CPS workers are not out to punish homeschoolers. In fact, they don't even want to be out there. They're overworked, they're underfunded, and they're trying to triage cases when they have an overabundance of cases on their caseload. They want to close cases where kids are safe. But they also have to respond to reports, and sometimes those reports can come from neighbors, relatives, or mandated reporters who genuinely don't understand what homeschooling looks like. And so where the system can break down is in cases like the ones that are making headlines right now, in a lot of them, CPS did get involved, and sometimes repeatedly, but they didn't act, or they closed the case prematurely, or information didn't get shared between the agencies, right? Like maybe the Department of Education knew that this family was homeschooling, but that wasn't shared with the Department of Children and Families. The problem in those cases wasn't that homeschooling was somehow too free, but that known abuse wasn't stopped. And I don't know that even blanket regulations, even in cases where CPS wasn't involved, blanket regulations on homeschooling won't necessarily fix a broken or under-resourced child protection system, but they will create burdens for families who aren't the problem. So, what's the answer? If more regulation isn't the solution, does that mean we do nothing? No, absolutely not. I believe that homeschoolers need to be proactive about building a culture of accountability, not because the state tells us to, but because it's the right thing to do, and because it protects our freedom in the long run. And here are some things that I think that can look like in practice. So, one, stay visible in your community. Isolation is a huge red flag for investigators. It's also not great for kids or parents, right? So join a co-op, a library program, a 4-H club, a sports league, or a homeschool park day. Let people see that your kids are thriving, and let your kids see other families learning in different ways too. The second thing I think we can do is to keep records, even if your state doesn't require them. A simple log of what you're reading, doing, and learning can go a long way. So if anyone ever questions you, or you have the evidence that you need to say, hey, no, we are actually educating and here's what we're doing. But more importantly, you also have clarity on your own child's progress. I take pictures of projects, I keep track of our yearly progress, and I note our activities and tasks on our calendar, even though I live in a state that doesn't require any of those things. The third thing that we can do are use objective measures when they're helpful. So standardized testing, I know a lot of us probably pulled our kids out, and one of the main reasons was standardized tests. But things like that and portfolio reviews and assessments don't have to be the enemy. They can just be tools. And you don't need to teach to the test, but periodic check-ins, whether they're formal or informal, can help you spot gaps and celebrate growth. And then they can also show outsiders that learning is happening. Even if your kiddo isn't a test taker, do something informal and make a note and keep track of that year over year. The fourth thing I think we can do is to maintain medical and dental care. Regular wellness visits create a paper trail that says this child is known, seen, and cared for. Doctors and dentists are mandated reporters, yes, but they're also trained to distinguish between normal childhood and neglect. So just because you go in and your kiddo has a bruise does not mean that they're going to assume that you're abusing your kiddo. When your doctor asks about homeschooling, because I believe a good checkup can and should include information about the child's education, share. My kiddo takes these classes out of the house and we love this curriculum and we have park day and we went to the cool museum the other day and he loved learning about robotics. Our pediatrician asks this every time that we visit. And my kiddos, now that they're old enough, they share their own things. They never know what grade they're in because she'll ask inevitably and they don't know, but they can tell you what they're learning about and the things that we did. And they can say, hey, it was boring, which by the way is really normal for kids to say. So I recommend sharing that information. 1, it normalizes homeschool. 2, it tells your provider what you're doing so they don't have to worry about you. And 3, it also gives your kids the opportunity to kind of have normal and natural conversations. The fifth thing that I think we can do is to know your state laws and then follow them. So even if you think your state requirements are unnecessary, following them can protect you legally. If you're in a notification state, notify. If you're in a state that requires testing, test. If you're in an unregulated state, like I am, document anyway. And then the last thing is, I think we as homeschoolers can build relationships with other homeschoolers, especially new ones. If you see that a family is struggling, offer help, share curriculum, invite them to your co-op. Be the community that catches people before they fall into true neglect. We can be each other's accountability without being each other's enforcers. And I think this can be really helpful because, honestly, a lot of times when I went into families and I noticed that there was neglect, there also was a mental illness component, like mom was depressed and dad was overworked, or having a community can help catch those things and provide the resources and services that might be needed for a family who might be on the fringe of that. And can provide the resources for like, hey, you need to put a curriculum into place so your kiddo can learn. And here's what I found helpful. This is all online. It's open and go. Or, hey, your kiddo really likes this kind of math, but they're really struggling with the math that you're giving them. Give this one a try and pass along books. We can be the community that our community needs. So let's transition. So that's kind of like community-based. Let's transition a little bit to strategy because bills like Connecticut's are going to keep coming. And I kind of thought about like, okay, well, what regulations do we think homeschoolers should have? Because my biggest reaction is no, none. I don't want any regulations, right? I think there are three things that homeschoolers should oppose. And I think there are three things that maybe we should consider supporting. So the three things we should oppose. One, I think we should oppose blanket bans on homeschooling for families without any DCF history. I'm sorry, with any DCF history. So Connecticut is wanting to propose a ban on homeschooling or withdrawing for homeschool if there's DCF involvement. But just because DCF was involved with the family doesn't necessarily mean that there is abuse or neglect happening. There's a distinction between substantiated abuse and unsubstantiated abuse or dismissed complaints. And I think that when DCF is involved, due process should occur. And we shouldn't ban someone from homeschooling simply for going through the due process. If they have a substantiated abuse or neglect claim, that can be a different situation. But if it's unsubstantiated, we shouldn't just blanket ban them from homeschooling or prevent them from withdrawing their kiddos. The second thing that I think we should oppose are mandatory home visits without cause or a warrant. Just because we're homeschoolers doesn't mean that we're denied our rights in the Constitution. And if someone reports us for educational neglect and a DCF worker shows up on our doorstep, I don't think that we should be required to let them in. Now, we can choose to, but I don't know that I don't think that should be required unless there's a warrant or some other cause. The third thing that I think we should oppose are requirements that treat homeschoolers more strictly than private schools. This happens in some schools that private schools can basically get away with whatever. Sorry, this happens in certain states where private schools can kind of get away with whatever they want and homeschoolers are much more regulated. And so any requirement that treats homeschoolers more strictly than a private school is being treated, I think that we should oppose that. There are three things that I think could actually help homeschoolers in terms of regulation. The first one is targeted interventions for families with substantiated abuse or neglect, including restrictions on withdrawing children mid-investigation. So if someone has an investigation and DCF is currently working on clearing their name, maybe we should be able to restrict their ability to withdraw their kiddo while that investigation, assuming the investigation can be timely, for homeschooling, right? So maybe targeted interventions where there are abuse or neglect. Two, I think that we could, depends on your state and what they might be suggesting, but encourage better data sharing between child welfare and education agencies when there's already an open case. So in some states, you have your Department of Education, they know you're homeschooling, they might even have records and have met with you on a regular basis, and then you have your child welfare agency who doesn't know any of that and maybe can't even ask. I don't know that I see a problem with sharing data between those agencies when a case is opened so that they can say like, oh yeah, no, actually they're homeschooling and I met with them, just 3 months ago to do an assessment. That I don't know that I see a problem with. The third thing is increased funding for CPS so they can actually investigate real cases instead of being overwhelmed and missing critical signs. I think the cases that are kind of hitting the news recently are clear suggestions that would be a good policy to have, more funding for those CPS workers, because I can attest to you that they have way more cases and way more children on their caseloads than they can truly give individual care to. So if that's something that you want to be involved in, you can reach out to your state legislators. You would want to use your real name and your real story and say something like, hey, I homeschool and here's why these proposals won't work. And then you can offer better alternatives. So don't just say, no, I hate all those regulations. I don't want any regulation. Maybe give suggestions for what you think will actually work. The other thing you can do is connect with state homeschool organizations like HSLDA affiliates or local coalitions, because they often have coordinated advocacy efforts that they're making, and they can help you stay informed with what is actually being proposed in your state. The other thing is you could write op-eds, post on social media, share your homeschool life openly. The more the public sees that homeschoolers are thriving and we're not hiding, the harder it is to paint all of us as hiding abuse. So Here's the last thing that I guess I kind of want to wrap this up by saying. It's easy to get defensive when we hear stories like the ones in the news. Our instinct is to say, that's not us. That's not homeschooling. And you're right. It's not. But we also can't pretend that homeschooling's legal flexibility has never been misused, because it has. Rarely, but it has. And when we refuse to acknowledge that, I think we lose credibility. The families who truly abuse or neglect their children while calling it homeschool are not part of us. They are not our community. They are not doing what we do. And it is okay, necessary even, to say that out loud. I don't think that child safety and homeschool freedom are opposites. They're both things that we should want. And when we show up as visible and accountable and engaged families, we make the case for educational freedom stronger, not weaker. So this week, I want to challenge you. Look at your own homeschool. Are you documenting progress in some way? Are your kids connected to community? And are you following your state's legal requirements? If not, if the answer is to any of those, not really, this is your gentle nudge, not because I think CPS is coming for you, but because strong practices can make strong homeschools. And if you're already doing all of that, great. Keep doing it, keep being visible, and keep being the example that makes the horror stories look like the outliers that they are. And you can be a great mentor to others who are joining our community. Homeschooling is an act of love. A lot of us love doing it, but it is also an act of responsibility, and we can hold both of those to be true at the same time. Thank you for listening to this episode of Continuing Education. If this conversation helped you think through these issues, share it with another homeschool family. And if you have thoughts, questions, or your own experiences with CPS or educational neglect, I'd love to hear from you. You can reach out to us at Continuing Education on our Substack.